Why let a kid touch these machines? They laughed at the black boy. But he turned out to be a. The smell hit you first. Motor oil mixed with rust, sweat, and dreams deferred. Martinez Auto Repair sat wedged between a pawn shop and a laundromat on Crenshaw Boulevard, its faded sign creaking in the Los Angeles wind like a tired old man's bones. Most people hurried past this corner of the city, but for 12-year-old Jalen Washington, this grimy sanctuary was everything. Boy, get your hands off that carburetor before you mess something up! Big Mike's voice boomed across the garage, his massive frame casting a shadow over the workbench where Jalen crouched, completely absorbed in dismantling a 1987 Buick engine part. Jalen didn't flinch. His small, oil-stained fingers continued their delicate work, removing each screw with the precision of a surgeon. 3 months of coming here after school had taught him that Big Mike's bark was worse than his bite, mostly. "I ain't gonna break nothing, Mr. Mike," Jalen replied, his voice steady despite being barely above a whisper. "Just trying to understand why this one's making that clicking sound." Laughter erupted from the other mechanics. Carlos, a stocky man with tattoos covering his arms, slapped his knee. "Listen to this kid. He thinks he's gonna diagnose engine problems now. Why let a kid touch these machines anyway?" sneered Tommy, the youngest of the grown mechanics at 24, but the cruelest in his mockery. "He'll break more than he fixes. This ain't no playground, little man." The words stung, but Jalen had learned to let them roll off him like water off a duck's back. He'd been hearing variations of the same things since he first wandered into the shop 3 months ago, drawn by the symphony of mechanical sounds that others found annoying. To him, every engine had its own voice, its own story to tell. "My daddy used to work on cars," Jalen said quietly, still focused on the carburetor. "Before he died." The laughter died down, but only for a moment. Tommy wasn't finished. "Yeah? Well, your daddy ain't here to teach you, and we ain't running no charity daycare center. These are real machines worth real money, not toys for kids to play pretend mechanic with." Jalen's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Instead, he reached into his backpack, a worn-out thing held together with duct tape, and pulled out a notebook. The cover was barely hanging on, and the pages were filled with his cramped handwriting, sketches, and diagrams he'd copied from library books and internet searches at school. "What's that supposed to be?" Carlos asked, genuinely curious despite himself. "Notes," Jalen replied, flipping to a page covered with engine diagrams. "About compression ratios, fuel injection systems, timing belts. Stuff like that." Big Mike walked over, wiping his hands on a rag that had seen better days. At 52, he'd been running this shop for 15 years, and in all that time, he'd never seen a kid like Jalen. The boy showed up every day at 3:30 p.m. sharp, right after school, and stayed until closing time at 7 p.m. He never asked for money, never got in the way of paying customers, and somehow always seemed to know exactly which tool to hand over before being asked. But Big Mike had a business to run, and a 12-year-old hanging around expensive equipment made his insurance company nervous. "Look, kid," Mike said, his voice softer than usual. "I appreciate your enthusiasm. But this stuff is dangerous. One wrong move and you could lose a finger. Or worse, you could damage something that costs more than your mama makes in a month." Jalen looked up from his notebook, his dark eyes serious beyond his years. "My grandmama makes pretty good money cleaning offices downtown. And I've been reading about safety protocols. See?" He flipped to another page, showing detailed notes about proper lifting techniques, chemical handling, and electrical safety. The mechanics exchanged glances. This wasn't normal 12-year-old behavior. "Where'd you learn all this?" Tommy asked, his mockery replaced by genuine bewilderment. "Library mostly. Got a computer card so I can use the internet for an hour each day. Sometimes I find old repair manuals in the dumpster behind Peterson's Auto Parts." Jalen's voice gained confidence as he talked about his passion. "Did you know that most engine knocking isn't actually caused by bad gas like people think? It's usually carbon buildup affecting the compression ratio, which changes the combustion timing and—" All right, Professor," Carlos interrupted, but he was smiling now. Damn, this kid knows more theory than half the guys who went to trade school. Theory ain't practice, Tommy shot back, his pride wounded. Book learning don't mean nothing when you got your hands deep in a real engine with a customer breathing down your neck. As if summoned by his words, the shop's bell chimed, and Mrs. Rodriguez walked in, her worry evident even from across the room. Mike, please tell me you figured out what's wrong with my Honda. I need it for work tomorrow, and I can't afford to miss another day. Big Mike's expression tightened. Mrs. Rodriguez's 2003 Honda Civic had been sitting in Bay 2 for 3 days, and none of them could figure out why it kept stalling randomly. They'd replaced the spark plugs, cleaned the fuel injectors, and checked every obvious component, but the problem persisted. We're still working on it, Maria. Should have it ready by. It's the idle air control valve, Jalen said quietly, still hunched over his notebook. The shop fell silent. Mrs. Rodriguez looked confused, while the mechanic stared at the boy in disbelief. What did you say? Big Mike asked. Jalen looked up, suddenly realizing everyone was staring at him. His confidence wavered for a moment, then strengthened as he thought about the problem logically. The idle air control valve, he repeated, standing up slowly. I heard the engine running yesterday when Carlos was testing it. It's got that irregular idle pattern that happens when the valve gets stuck partially open. Probably carbon deposits. The computer keeps trying to compensate, which is why it stalls randomly instead of all the time. Tommy laughed, but it sounded forced. Kid thinks he diagnosed a car by listening to it for 5 minutes. I didn't just listen, Jalen said, opening his notebook to a fresh page where he'd been sketching. I drew the sound pattern. See? These peaks represent the RPM fluctuations. They match the signature of a faulty IAC valve. He had actually drawn the sound. Wavy lines that somehow made sense, with numbers and annotations in the margins. Big Mike stared at the notebook, then at the boy, then back at the notebook. In 15 years of running this shop, he'd never seen anything like it. The kid had turned engine diagnostics into some kind of art form. Carlos, Mike said slowly, go check the idle air control valve on Mrs. Rodriguez's Honda. Mike, come on, you're not seriously. Check it. 20 minutes later, Carlos emerged from under the hood, holding a small, carbon-caked component. His expression was somewhere between amazement and annoyance. Kid was right, he announced. Valve's completely gummed up. Clean this out, and she should run perfect. The shop erupted in surprised chatter, but Jalen had already returned to his carburetor, acting as if correctly diagnosing a car problem by ear was the most natural thing in the world. Mrs. Rodriguez beamed. How much do I owe you for finding the problem? Big Mike looked at Jalen, who was pretending not to listen while clearly hanging on every word. Nothing extra, Mike said finally. Kid earned his keep today. As Mrs. Rodriguez left with promises to return with her car running perfectly, the atmosphere in the shop had shifted. The laughter wasn't quite as cruel, the comments not quite as dismissive. But Tommy wasn't ready to let it go. Lucky guess, he muttered. Broken clocks right twice a day. Jalen closed his notebook and packed up his tools, a small collection of screwdrivers and wrenches he'd bought with money saved from collecting aluminum cans. As he headed for the door, Big Mike called out, Hey, kid! Same time tomorrow? Jalen turned, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Yes, sir. Got some ideas about improving fuel efficiency I want to test. As the door closed behind him, the mechanic stood in silence for a moment, processing what had just happened. That ain't normal, Carlos said finally. No, Big Mike agreed, staring at the spot where Jalen had been working. It ain't. Outside, Jalen walked through the gathering dust toward home, his notebook clutched tightly to his chest. Tomorrow would bring more mockery, more doubt, more people telling him he was too young, too small, too inexperienced to understand the complex world of automotive repair. But tonight, for the first time in 3 months, he had proven them wrong. And deep in his heart, where dreams took root in the fertile soil of determination, Jalen Washington knew this was only the beginning. Jalen's victory with Mrs. Rodriguez's Honda should have earned him respect. Instead, it made Tommy Ferguson angrier than ever. "One lucky guess don't make you no mechanic," Tommy muttered the next morning, deliberately stepping on the tools Jalen had carefully arranged on a clean shop rag. "You still just a kid playing with grown-up toys." It had been 2 weeks since the diagnosis that stunned everyone, but instead of acceptance, the mockery had grown sharper, more personal. Tommy seemed to take Jalen's knowledge as a threat to his own position as the shop's youngest mechanic. "Tommy, leave the boy alone," Big Mike called from across the garage, but his attention was focused on a transmission rebuild, and his words carried no real weight. Tommy waited until Mike was distracted, then grabbed Jalen's notebook, the sacred collection of diagrams, calculations, and observations that represented months of learning. "Let's see what Professor Jalen's been cooking up," Tommy said loudly, flipping through pages with his oil-stained hands. "Look at this mess. Kid thinks he's some kind of engineer." Jalen's heart hammered as he watched Tommy handle his life's work carelessly. "Please give it back. Those notes took me months to." "Oh, did I hurt your feelings?" Tommy's voice dripped with fake sympathy. "Maybe you should run home to Grandmama and cry about it." The bell above the door chimed, and Mr. Pedersen walked in with his teenage son David. Mr. Pedersen owned 3 luxury car dealerships and was one of the shop's most important customers. His son David, 17 and driving a brand new BMW, looked around the grimy shop with obvious disgust. "Is this where you bring the Porsche?" David asked his father, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "This place looks like a dump. Best mechanics in the city work out of places like this," Mr. Pedersen replied. "Character builds skill, not fancy equipment." Tommy saw an opportunity. He held up Jalen's notebook like it was evidence in a trial. "Speaking of character, check this out. We got ourselves a wannabe mechanic here. Kid's 12 years old and thinks he knows more about cars than guys who've been doing this for decades." Mr. Pedersen glanced at Jalen, who was now covered in his usual uniform of grease and determination. David burst out laughing. "Seriously? That little kid thinks he's a mechanic?" David's laughter was cruel, the kind that comes from someone who's never had to work for anything. "What's next, letting toddlers perform brain surgery?" "Right." Tommy encouraged the mockery. "Kid spends all day taking apart junk engines and scribbling in this notebook like he's solving rocket science. Yesterday he tried to tell Carlos how to adjust a timing belt." "And I was right," Jalen said quietly, but his voice was lost in the laughter. "Look at him." David pointed at Jalen's oil-stained clothes and serious expression. "He looks like a homeless kid playing mechanic. Does he even know how to read?" The words hit Jalen like physical blows. He'd heard cruel comments before, but never with such venom, never with paying customers joining in the humiliation. "I read just fine," Jalen said, his voice stronger now. "I read engineering journals, repair manuals, technical specifications." "Sure you do, kid," David interrupted. "And I'm the next Formula One champion." Tommy's cruelty reached new heights. He accidentally knocked over Jalen's carefully sorted collection of spare parts, washers, bolts, and small components Jalen had been organizing by size and thread count. "Oops," Tommy said with exaggerated innocence. "Guess you'll have to start over, Professor." As Jalen knelt to collect the scattered parts, other customers began to notice the commotion. Mrs. Chen, waiting for her minivan's oil change, shook her head disapprovingly. "Poor child," she said to her friend. "What are his parents thinking, letting him play in such a dangerous place?" "Probably doesn't have parents," her friend replied in a stage whisper. "Look how dirty he is. Someone should call social services." Jalen's hands trembled as he gathered his scattered tools. Each cruel word felt like another weight added to his chest, making it harder to breathe, harder to maintain the dignity that his grandmother had taught him was more important than any insult. But the worst was yet to come. That evening, as Jalen was preparing to leave, Tommy approached him with a twisted smile. "Hey, kid. I got a special project for you tomorrow. Think you can handle it? Jalen looked up hopefully. Maybe Tommy was finally ready to accept his abilities. There's a 1994 Ford Escort in Bay 3. Customer says it won't start. Real challenging case for a genius like you. The next morning, Jalen arrived early, eager to prove himself on Tommy's special project. He found the Ford Escort and immediately began his methodical diagnosis. Battery was good. Fuel pump was working. Spark plugs were firing. But something felt wrong. The car had an odd smell, not the usual mechanical odors he was used to, but something chemical. As he traced the electrical system, he discovered the problem. Someone had deliberately disconnected multiple wiring harnesses and loosened critical connections. It wasn't a broken car. It was a trap. Finding any problems, Professor? Tommy's voice came from behind him, accompanied by the snickers of Carlos and 2 other mechanics who had gathered to watch the show. Jalen understood immediately. This was sabotage designed to make him look foolish. Tommy had probably spent an hour creating fake problems that would confuse and frustrate him. You messed with this car, Jalen said quietly. What? That's a serious accusation, kid. You calling me a liar? Tommy's voice was dangerously loud, drawing attention from everyone in the shop. I'm saying someone disconnected these harnesses on purpose. Look. Jalen pointed to the obviously tampered connections. These clips are barely hanging on, and there's fresh tool marks on the terminals. Big Mike walked over, his expression darkening as he examined Jalen's discoveries. Tommy. Mike's voice was dangerously quiet. Did you mess with this car? Why would I do that? Kid probably loosened everything himself trying to look smart. But Big Mike wasn't buying it. He could see the evidence clearly, the methodical way connections had been loosened, the deliberate nature of the sabotage. This ends now, Mike said firmly. Tommy, you got something to say to Jalen? Tommy's face reddened with anger and embarrassment. Being called out in front of everyone was more than his pride could handle. I ain't apologizing to no kid, he snarled. This is a real shop, not some daycare center. You want to baby him, that's on you. That night, Jalen walked home with heavier steps than usual. The cruelty had escalated beyond simple teasing into active sabotage. But as he turned the corner onto his street, he saw his grandmother Rosa sitting on the porch, her weathered hands busy with her evening knitting. How was your day at the shop, baby? She asked, her voice carrying the warmth that always made everything better. Jalen sat beside her, still smelling of motor oil and disappointment. Grandmama, tell me again about Daddy. Rosa set down her knitting and wrapped her arms around her grandson's shoulders. Your daddy was the smartest man I ever knew when it came to engines, she said softly. Could make any car sing like a choir. But the world wasn't ready for a black man with his kind of genius. They overlooked him, passed him over, told him he wasn't qualified for jobs he could do in his sleep. Did it make him angry? Sometimes. But mostly it made him determined. He used to say, Rosa, they can doubt me all they want, but they can't doubt results. He kept learning, kept improving, kept proving himself one car at a time. Jalen leaned against his grandmother's shoulder, finding strength in her words. Those men at the shop, they're scared. Rosa continued. Scared that a 12-year-old boy might know something they don't. Fear makes people cruel, baby. But it also makes them wrong. As the evening settled around them, Jalen made a silent promise to his father's memory and his grandmother's faith. Tomorrow he would return to the shop. He would endure the mockery, the sabotage, the cruel laughter. But he would also keep learning, keep observing, keep filling his notebook with the knowledge that would one day silence every doubt. The boy who was too young to understand machines was about to show them what understanding really meant. The roar of the transport truck's engine announced something extraordinary was coming to Martinez Auto Repair. Jalen looked up from the transmission he was studying, his heart skipping as he watched the massive flatbed carefully navigate into the shop's narrow bay. What the hell is that? Carlos whispered, wiping his hands on his coveralls as the truck's hydraulic lift began lowering its precious cargo. What emerged was automotive poetry in motion, a sleek, midnight blue Formula 3000 race car that seemed to glow under the shop's fluorescent lights. The vehicle looked completely out of place in the grimy garage, like a thoroughbred stallion in a barnyard. "That's a Reynard 90D. Jalen breathed, his voice filled with reverence. He'd seen pictures in racing magazines, but never imagined he'd witness one in person. Tommy snorted. "Look at the kid getting all excited over some fancy go-kart. Probably thinks it runs on magic." The truck driver climbed down and approached Big Mike with a clipboard. "Delivery for Martinez Auto Repair. This beauty belongs to Velocity Racing Team. They got a race at Willow Springs this weekend, and their regular shop couldn't figure out the problem." A sleek black BMW pulled up behind the truck, and two men in expensive racing jackets emerged. The first was Marcus Webb, team owner and former driver whose success had made him wealthy but not necessarily wise about modern engines. The second was Derek Chin, the current driver, young and talented but clearly frustrated. "You Mike Martinez?" Webb asked, his tone suggesting he'd rather be anywhere else. "We heard you guys work miracles on impossible cases." Big Mike straightened his shoulders, trying to project confidence he didn't feel. "Depends on the problem." "What's wrong with her?" Derek stepped forward, his racing suit pristine and his demeanor tense. "She's losing power randomly during races. Sometimes she's perfect, other times she feels like she's running on 3 cylinders. We've had her to 3 different shops, including the official Reynard Service Center in Orange County." "And?" Carlos asked. "Nothing," Webb said with frustration. "They've replaced everything, fuel pumps, ignition systems, sensors, even rebuilt the entire engine. Spent $40,000 and she still acts up. We got qualifying runs tomorrow, and if we can't fix this..." He didn't need to finish. Everyone understood. A racing team without a reliable car was finished. Tommy puffed out his chest, eager to impress the wealthy customers. "Well, you came to the right place. I've worked on plenty of high-performance engines. Let me take a look under the hood." Webb nodded, and Tommy immediately began his inspection with the confident swagger of someone trying to prove himself. He checked obvious components, made authoritative-sounding comments, and generally performed for his audience. "Fuel pressure looks good," Tommy announced. "Ignition timing seems right. Maybe it's the ECU mapping." Derek rolled his eyes. "The computer's been reprogrammed twice. The problem isn't software." For an hour, Tommy poked and prodded, growing increasingly frustrated as he found nothing wrong. Carlos joined the effort, then Big Mike, but the car's problems remained mysterious. Meanwhile, Jalen had quietly positioned himself where he could observe the engine. He couldn't get close enough to touch anything. Webb had made it clear that the kid should stay away from the expensive machinery, but he could listen. And what he heard was fascinating. "Fire her up again," Tommy called out, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. Derek climbed into the cockpit and turned the key. The engine roared to life with a sound that made Jalen's heart race, 12 cylinders singing in perfect harmony. But as he listened more carefully, his trained ear caught something the others missed. There was a rhythm to the irregularity. A pattern. Jalen pulled out his notebook and began sketching the sound waves, just as he'd done with Mrs. Rodriguez's Honda. But this was more complex, a symphony of mechanical precision with one instrument slightly out of tune. "Try revving to 6,000 RPM. Tommy shouted over the engine noise. As the RPMs climbed, Jalen's pencil moved faster. The pattern became clearer. It wasn't a consistent problem, it was intermittent, triggered by specific conditions. "Shut her down," Webb ordered after 10 minutes of fruitless revving. "This is useless. You guys obviously can't handle a machine this sophisticated." "Now wait a minute," Big Mike protested. "Give us more time. These things can be tricky." "We don't have more time," Derek exploded. "Qualifying is tomorrow morning. If we can't figure this out in the next few hours, we're pulling out of the race. That's a $20,000 entry fee down the drain, plus sponsor obligations." The shop fell silent except for the ticking of the cooling engine. Tommy's face was red with embarrassment, Carlos looked defeated, and Big Mike seemed to be calculating how much business this failure would cost him. That's when Jalen cleared his throat. "Excuse me," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the ambient noise. Webb turned toward the sound with irritation. "Kid, this isn't the time for. I think I know what's wrong with your car." The statement hung in the air like a challenge. Tommy laughed, but it sounded forced and desperate. "Oh, this is rich. The 12-year-old thinks he can solve what 3 professional shops couldn't figure out." Webb's expression shifted from irritation to disbelief. "Are you serious right now? A child?" Derek looked between Jalen and the adults, his desperation overriding his skepticism. "What do you think you hear?" Jalen opened his notebook to his fresh sketches. "It's not a mechanical problem. It's thermal. The issue only happens when specific temperature conditions are met, which is why it's so random." "Thermal?" Tommy scoffed. "Kid, the cooling system's been checked a dozen times." "Not the cooling system," Jalen continued, his confidence growing as he explained his theory. "The fuel rail. When it heats up to a certain temperature, the fuel pressure becomes inconsistent. But it's not the pump or the regulator, it's thermal expansion in the rail itself causing microscopic changes in fuel flow." The adults stared at him in stunned silence. "That's..." Derek started then stopped. "That's actually possible. But how could you know that from just listening?" Jalen pointed to his drawings. "The power loss happens in cycles that match thermal expansion rates. See these patterns? They're not random, they follow heat buildup curves." Webb looked at the notebook, then at Jalen, then at his expensive race car. His entire weekend, his team's reputation, and thousands of dollars hung in the balance. "This is insane," he muttered. "I'm supposed to trust a kid who probably doesn't even have a driver's license." But Derek was studying Jalen's sketches with growing excitement. "Marcus, look at this. These calculations, this actually makes sense. If he's right, it would explain everything, why the problem's intermittent, why it only happens during races when the engine's under sustained load, why replacing components didn't help." The shop held its collective breath as Webb made his decision. The race team owner looked at his car, then at his frustrated driver, then at the 12-year-old boy holding a battered notebook. "If you're wrong," Webb said slowly, "we lose everything." Jalen met his gaze steadily. "If I'm right, you win." In that moment, desperation triumphed over prejudice, and the most important opportunity of Jalen's young life was about to begin. The silence in Martinez Auto Repair stretched like a taut wire, everyone waiting for Marcus Webb's decision. Jalen stood perfectly still, his notebook clutched against his chest, while the adults around him wrestled with the impossible choice between logic and desperation. "This is absolutely crazy," Webb muttered, running his hands through his graying hair. "My entire career, everything I've built, and I'm supposed to trust a 12-year-old? Tommy seized the moment to reassert himself. "Marcus, don't listen to this kid. He's been hanging around here for months, pretending he knows about cars. Yesterday he couldn't even change a tire properly." "That's not true," Jalen said quietly, but his voice carried a new strength. "And I never tried to change a tire yesterday. I was working on carburetor timing adjustments." Derek Chen looked between the adults and the boy, his racer's instincts recognizing something they couldn't see. "Marcus, we're out of options. 3 shops, $40,000, and we're still sitting here with a broken car 12 hours before qualifying." "But a kid?" Webb's voice cracked with frustration. "My sponsors will think I've lost my mind." "Your sponsors will think you've lost your mind when we don't make the starting grid," Derek shot back. "At least let him explain his theory properly." Big Mike stepped forward, surprising everyone. "Webb, I've been running this shop for 15 years. I've seen a lot of mechanics come and go, and I'm telling you straight, this boy knows things that grown men with decades of experience don't know. I can't explain it, but I've seen him diagnose problems that stumped all of us." Carlos nodded reluctantly. "Kid was right about Mrs. Rodriguez's Honda when we were all wrong. Called it from 20 feet away just by listening." Tommy's face reddened. That was luck. One lucky guess doesn't mean. Explain the thermal expansion theory. Derek interrupted, turning to Jalen. If you're right, how would we fix it? Jalen opened his notebook to a detailed diagram he'd been sketching while the adults argued. The fuel rail expands when it heats up under sustained high RPM conditions. Most people don't notice because street cars never maintain racing speeds long enough for the effect to matter. But in a race, after 15 or 20 minutes of high-speed running, the rail expands just enough to change the fuel pressure dynamics. He pointed to his calculations. The pressure drop isn't enough to trigger the computer's fault codes, but it's enough to cause inconsistent fuel delivery to cylinders 7 and 12 specifically, because they're at the end of the fuel rail where the pressure differential is most pronounced. Webb stared at the notebook, his skepticism warring with the technical accuracy of what he was hearing. Even if that's true, how would you fix it? Replace the fuel rail with one made from a different alloy that has a lower expansion coefficient, or modify the existing rail with thermal compensation spacers. But there's a faster solution for tomorrow's race. Jalen flipped to another page, showing a simple modification diagram. Install thermal barrier strips along the fuel rail to reduce heat transfer from the engine block. It won't eliminate the problem completely, but it should reduce the thermal expansion enough to get you through qualifying and the race. The shop fell silent as the adults processed this explanation. Even Tommy seemed stunned by the sophistication of Jalen's analysis. Derek's eyes lit up with understanding. That would explain why the problem got worse during our last race at Phoenix. It was 102 degrees that day, so the baseline temperature was already higher. Exactly, Jalen said, his confidence growing. And why it rarely happens during practice sessions. They're too short for the heat buildup to reach critical levels. Webb looked at his watch. If we're going to try this, we need to start now. The thermal barrier strips, where do we get them? Auto parts store should have heat shield material, Big Mike said. But kid, you sure about this? If you're wrong. I know, Jalen said simply. But I'm not wrong. What happened next shocked everyone, including Jalen himself. Webb made a decision that went against every instinct screaming in his head. Do it, he said. But I want to see every step. If this goes wrong, I need to understand why. Tommy exploded. You're going to let a 12-year-old modify a $100,000 race car? This is insane. What's insane is losing this race because we're too proud to listen, Derek said firmly. Marcus, let's do this. For the next 3 hours, Jalen worked on the Formula 3000 with a precision that left the adults speechless. His small hands moved with surgeon-like confidence as he carefully installed thermal barrier strips along the fuel rail, explaining each step to Derek and Webb. The strips need to be positioned to block radiant heat from the exhaust manifold without interfering with fuel flow, he said, his voice steady despite the weight of everyone's expectations. And we need to ensure the mounting doesn't create vibration points that could cause fatigue failure. Tommy watched from a distance, his earlier mockery replaced by a grudging amazement that he refused to acknowledge. But Jalen wasn't finished. As he worked, he noticed other inefficiencies in the engine setup. Your air intake positioning is reducing efficiency by about 3%. He mentioned casually while tightening a clamp. If you moved it 6 inches forward and angled it differently, you'd pick up maybe 8 horsepower. Derek and Webb exchanged glances. Show us, Webb said. 20 minutes later, with simple repositioning and a custom bracket Jalen fabricated from scrap metal, the engine's air intake was optimized in a way that the professional racing shops had missed. Fire her up, Webb said, his voice tight with anticipation. Derek climbed into the cockpit and turned the key. The engine roared to life, but this time something was different. The sound was cleaner, more powerful, the idle smoother than it had been in months. Take her to redline, Webb called out. As the RPMs climbed, everyone held their breath. 6,000 RPM. 7,000, 8,000. The engine sang like a perfectly tuned instrument, no hesitation, no power loss, just pure mechanical perfection. Shut her down, Webb said quietly. In the sudden silence, He turned to face Jalen, his expression a mixture of amazement and something approaching awe. "Son," he said slowly, "that engine sounds better than it has since the day we bought it." The shop erupted in surprised chatter, but Tommy's voice cut through the noise. "One test doesn't prove anything. Wait until tomorrow's race. Then we'll see if the kid's miracle holds up." Webb nodded, but his eyes never left Jalen. "Tomorrow's qualifying starts at 8 a.m. Kid, would you consider coming with us? I want you there when we put this theory to the real test." Jalen looked around the shop, at Big Mike's proud smile, Carlos's grudging respect, and Tommy's barely contained fury. "Yes, sir," he said quietly. "I'll be there." What none of them knew was that tomorrow wouldn't just test Jalen's mechanical theories. It would change everything. The Willow Springs Raceway buzzed with pre-qualifying energy at 7:30 a.m., but Jalen had never felt more out of place. Standing next to the Velocity Racing team's pit area in his cleanest jeans and a borrowed team shirt that hung loose on his small frame, he watched million-dollar race cars prepare for battle while trying to ignore the stares and whispers. "Is that really the kid who fixed Webb's car?" a voice carried from the neighboring pit. "He looks like he should be in middle school." "He is in middle school," someone replied with a laugh. But Marcus Webb wasn't laughing. He'd arrived at the track that morning to find 3 racing journalists and 2 automotive engineers waiting to meet the 12-year-old mechanic who solved what 3 professional shops couldn't. "Jalen," Webb called, motioning him over to where a woman with a press badge stood holding a tablet. "This is Sarah Martinez from Racing Weekly. She wants to ask you about yesterday's repair." Sarah Martinez looked skeptical as she studied Jalen's young face. "You're really the one who diagnosed the thermal expansion problem?" "Yes, ma'am," Jalen replied quietly, still intimidated by all the attention. "Can you explain in simple terms what you found?" For the next 10 minutes, Jalen walked Sarah through his analysis, using his battered notebook to illustrate the thermal dynamics and pressure differential calculations. As he spoke, a small crowd gathered, other team owners, mechanics, and racing officials drawn by curiosity about the boy who was making headlines before the race even started. "That's remarkably sophisticated analysis," said Dr. Jennifer Chin, a mechanical engineer from Caltech who'd driven 2 hours to meet Jalen after hearing about his work. "Most graduate students would struggle with that level of thermal fluid dynamics." "I just read a lot," Jalen said modestly, but his confidence was growing as he realized these adults were genuinely interested in his ideas, not mocking them. At exactly 8 a.m., Derek Chin fired up the Formula 3000 for qualifying. The engine's sound was pure perfection, aggressive yet smooth, powerful yet controlled. As Derek pulled onto the track for his warm-up lap, Webb's radio crackled to life. "Marcus, this thing feels incredible. Better than it's ever felt." The qualifying session was a revelation. Derek's first lap broke the track record by 0.3 of a second. His second lap broke his own record. By the end of the 20-minute session, he'd secured pole position with a time that stunned even veteran racing observers. "How much of this improvement is from the kid's work?" asked Tom Richardson, owner of the championship-leading team that had been dominating all season. Webb grinned. "All of it. The thermal barrier fixed our power loss problem, but his air intake modification gave us extra horsepower we didn't even know we were missing." Word spread through the paddock like wildfire. By noon, Jalen found himself surrounded by team owners, engineers, and journalists, all asking variations of the same question: how does a 12-year-old know more about race car engineering than professionals with decades of experience? "I started learning because I wanted to understand," Jalen explained to a group of fascinated adults. "Most people stop asking why when something works. I keep asking why until I understand why it works." Dr. Chin had been listening intently. During a break in the interviews, she approached Jalen privately. "I run an advanced automotive research program at Caltech," she said. "We're developing hybrid powertrains and advanced materials for next-generation race cars. Would you be interested in visiting our lab?" Jalen's eyes widened. "You mean see real research? Like cutting-edge stuff?" I mean potentially collaborating on real research. Your approach to problem solving is exactly what we need, someone who sees patterns others miss. But the day's biggest surprise came during the actual race. Derek didn't just win, he dominated, leading every lap and finishing 12 seconds ahead of the second-place car. More importantly, the engine ran flawlessly for the entire 90-minute race, proving Jalen's thermal theory under the most demanding conditions possible. As Derek climbed out of the car in victory lane, he immediately sought out Jalen in the crowd. "This win belongs to you, kid," Derek said, pulling Jalen into the celebration. "Without your fix, we wouldn't even have qualified." The cameras captured everything, the young black boy being hoisted onto the shoulders of a professional race car driver, his notebook still clutched in his hand, his face beaming with pure joy. But back at Martinez Auto Repair, the celebration had a different tone. Tommy Ferguson watched the race coverage on the shop's small TV, his face darkening with each mention of the 12-year-old genius who revolutionized velocity racing's performance. "Lucky guess," he muttered to Carlos. "Kid got lucky once, and now everyone thinks he's some kind of miracle worker." Carlos shook his head. "Tommy, man, you need to let this go. Kid proved himself fair and square." "Proved what?" "That he can read some engineering books and sound smart. Real mechanics don't need books, they learn with their hands, in shops like this, working on real cars for real customers." But even as Tommy spoke, the phone rang. And rang. And rang. Big Mike fielded calls from automotive magazines, engineering firms, and racing teams, all asking the same thing: could they speak with Jalen Washington? By closing time, Big Mike had received 47 calls, 16 emails, and visits from 2 automotive journalists and a documentary filmmaker. "Kid's famous," Carlos said, shaking his head in amazement. 12 years old and already more famous than any of us will ever be. That evening, Jalen returned to the shop to find a different atmosphere entirely. The mockery was gone, replaced by something he never experienced before: respect. "Jalen," Big Mike called him over. "Got some people who want to meet you. Engineers from Ford, BMW, even Tesla. They're flying in next week just to talk." But the most important conversation happened later, when Dr. Chen called Jalen's grandmother directly. "Mrs. Washington," she said, "your grandson has a gift that appears maybe once in a generation. With your permission, I'd like to arrange advanced tutoring, lab access, and mentorship opportunities that could accelerate his learning by years." Rosa Washington listened carefully, then asked the question that mattered most. "Will this help him or hurt him? He's still just a 12-year-old boy." "Ma'am," Dr. Chen replied, "I think your grandson stopped being just anything the moment he decided to solve problems that stumped everyone else. The question isn't whether we can help him, it's whether we can keep up with him." That night, as Jalen sat on his grandmother's porch reviewing the day's events, he opened his notebook to a fresh page and began sketching new ideas: hybrid engine designs, advanced materials applications, and revolutionary concepts that existed nowhere else in the world. The boy who'd been mocked for touching machines was about to touch the future itself. But first, he had one more surprise waiting back at the shop. 2 years later, the sleek glass building on Crenshaw Boulevard looked nothing like the rundown auto shop that once stood in its place. The chrome letters above the entrance read, "Washington Advanced Automotive Research Center." And through the floor-to-ceiling windows, passers-by could see millions of dollars worth of cutting-edge equipment where greasy workbenches used to sit. 14-year-old Jalen Washington stood in his private office on the second floor, wearing a crisp white lab coat over jeans, reviewing holographic engine schematics that floated in the air before him. His notebook, now digitized but still handwritten, contained designs that had revolutionized 3 major automotive manufacturers and earned him patents worth $47 million. "Jalen," his assistant called through the intercom, "your 3 p.m. appointment is here." Jalen smiled, knowing exactly who was waiting. "Send him up." Tommy Ferguson walked into the office like a man attending his own execution. At 26, he looked older than his years, his confidence replaced by the desperate humility of someone whose world had completely flipped upside down. Jalen, Tommy said, struggling with words he never thought he'd speak. Thank you for agreeing to see me. Jalen gestured to a chair across from his desk, the same calm demeanor he'd shown as a 12-year-old boy facing mockery now displayed as a teenager conducting business worth millions. What can I do for you, Tommy? I need a job. The words came out like a confession. I've been unemployed for 8 months. Nobody in the industry will hire me after what happened at Martinez's shop. They all know I was the one who... He couldn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Everyone in automotive circles knew the story of Tommy Ferguson, the mechanic who'd ridiculed and sabotaged the boy genius who went on to revolutionize the entire industry. Jalen opened a file on his tablet. I see you applied to work for Ford, BMW, Tesla, and 6 racing teams. All rejected your application. Yes. Tommy's voice was barely a whisper. They said I lacked the vision and character they're looking for in modern automotive professionals. And what makes you think I should hire you when they wouldn't? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Tommy had rehearsed this moment for weeks, but sitting across from the teenager whose potential he tried to crush made every prepared word feel inadequate. Because, Tommy said slowly, you're better than I was. Better than I ever could be. And maybe working for someone like you might teach me something about what real mechanical genius looks like. Jalen studied Tommy's face, seeing genuine remorse for the first time. But he wasn't finished. Tell me about the Ford Escort, Jalen said quietly. Tommy's face crumpled. I disconnected the wiring harnesses. Made it look broken so you'd fail and everyone would see you weren't as smart as you acted. I was threatened by a 12-year-old kid, and I handled it like a coward. And Mrs. Rodriguez's Honda? You were right about the idle air control valve. I knew it too, but I couldn't admit it. Couldn't admit that a kid had diagnosed something I missed. Jalen leaned back in his chair, processing not just Tommy's confession but the journey that had brought them both to this moment. I remember every insult, Jalen said finally. Every cruel laugh, every time you told people I was just a kid playing with toys. But I also remember what my grandmother taught me, that fear makes people cruel, but it also makes them wrong. He stood up and walked to the window overlooking Crenshaw Boulevard, where kids from the neighborhood gathered every afternoon for the free automotive engineering classes his foundation provided. Look down there, Tommy. See those kids working on the hybrid prototypes. Tommy joined him at the window, watching children aged 8 to 16 collaborating on projects that would have been impossible in university labs just 5 years earlier. Every one of those kids was told they were too young, too inexperienced, too something to understand advanced engineering. But we're proving them wrong, one innovation at a time. Jalen turned back to Tommy. I'll give you a job. Not because you deserve it, but because those kids down there deserve to see that everyone can change, everyone can grow, and everyone deserves a second chance. Tommy's eyes filled with tears. Jalen, I don't know what to say. Say you'll help me teach them. Say you'll use your experience, both the technical knowledge and the mistakes, to make sure no kid ever gets treated the way you treated me. I will. I swear I will. 6 months later, Tommy Ferguson found himself in the most unlikely position of his life, assistant instructor in the Washington Foundation's Youth Automotive Program, teaching 8-year-old Maria Santos how to rebuild a carburetor while her 10-year-old brother Carlos designed fuel injection improvements on a computer. Mr. Tommy? Maria asked, her small hands confidently handling tools that most adults found intimidating. Why do some grown-ups say kids can't understand machines? Tommy glanced across the workshop to where Jalen was explaining quantum battery theory to a group of teenagers, his voice carrying the same quiet confidence it had possessed even at 12. Because, Maria, Tommy said softly, sometimes grown-ups forget that the best way to understand something isn't to know everything about it, it's to never stop asking why. Down the street, the empty lot where Martinez Auto Repair once stood had been converted into a community garden. Big Mike had retired early with the generous settlement Jalen's foundation provided, and Carlos now ran a successful shop specializing in hybrid conversions, using techniques Jalen had developed. But the real revolution wasn't in the patents or the profits, it was in the hundreds of young minds that now approached mechanical problems with fearless curiosity, knowing that their age was an advantage, not a limitation. On the wall of Jalen's office hung a framed photograph from that day at Willow Springs Raceway, a 12-year-old boy being lifted onto the shoulders of a professional race car driver, his notebook clutched tightly in his small hands. Beneath it, a plaque bore the inscription that had become the Washington Foundation's motto. They laughed when he touched the machines. The machines are laughing now. At 16, Jalen Washington would become the youngest person ever inducted into the Automotive Hall of Fame. At 18, his revolutionary hydrogen-electric hybrid design would power the cars that won both the Indianapolis 500 and the 24 Hours of Le Mans. But it all started in a rundown shop on Crenshaw Boulevard, with a 12-year-old boy who refused to stop asking why, and refused to believe that curiosity had an age limit. The kid they said would break more than he fixed had instead broken every rule about what was possible. And in doing so, he fixed everything.